Johnny Depp and Penelope Cruz appear without warning in a stark black-and-white video. No music, just the raw silence between two exhausted faces. No one expected them to choose this moment to expose a truth buried for years, a confession powerful enough to shake Hollywood. And what they are about to reveal will change everything. But why break the silence now? Before that announcement reverberated across Hollywood, there existed a quiet darkness only the two of them truly understood. Johnny Depp had spent years being ground down by legal battles, media storms, and the chilling silence of people who once claimed to stand beside him. Behind the red carpets and the immortal roles was a man slowly eroded by misunderstanding, by narratives he could not control, and by a weight he could no longer carry alone. Sleepless nights stretched into one another like a rope tightening around his chest. Depp admitted that some mornings he woke unsure of where he was, unsure which headline would attack him next, unsure whether he had the strength to move forward. The world saw a mythic figure, but those closest to him saw a man circling the edges of a vast emotional void, unable to tell where the pain ended and the exhaustion began. Meanwhile, Hollywood kept turning, cold, mechanical, and different. New films, new faces, new contracts. Younger, cleaner, more convenient replacements stood ready to take his place. No one asked how long he could endure. No one cared about the heavy silences between court dates or the moments when he faded into himself, unable to defend a life he barely recognized anymore. And somewhere inside that bleakness, Penelope Cruz became a strange kind of light. Not blinding, not loud, just warm enough to keep someone from breaking apart. She didn't issue statements, didn't posture for public sympathy. Her presence was quieter, a call at 2 a.m., a soft reminder to eat, or simply the steady calm of sitting beside him when words were impossible. Her empathy didn't come from pity, but from her own scars. Cruz knew what it meant to be watched, dissected, followed by cameras that never cared who she really was. She understood the cost of fame, of becoming a public property that people felt free to interpret, attack, or distort. Between them existed a strange contrast. Depp, exhausted, pushed to the outer edges of the same industry that once crowned him. Cruz, steady, but carrying the deep fear of watching a friend slip too far into silence. That contrast created an invisible thread pulling them closer during their darkest hours. Their conversations were not always spoken. Sometimes it was a shared breath, a long stare into nothing, a moment suspended in the kind of quiet only two wounded people can inhabit. Cruz's unannounced visits, just to confirm he was still there, still breathing, still fighting. Depp confessing, in a whisper, that he wasn't sure he could take another hit from the outside world. All these fragments, the silence, the fear, the unspoken loyalty, formed the hidden backdrop of the announcement they would eventually reveal. Because no one breaks silence unless silence has stopped being a refuge. And the truth they carried was not merely Hollywood's truth, but the truth of two people who had gone too far into the shadows to pretend anymore. Yet the most haunting question remained suspended between them, a crack waiting to be touched. What pushed them to speak now, and why choose to speak together? Their story did not begin with headlines or scandal, nor with the polished glamour of film premieres. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the spaces between exhaustion and understanding. The kind of connection that forms not through triumphs, but through wounds. Johnny Depp and Penelope Cruz had always been linked in the public imagination as co-stars, collaborators, two charismatic figures moving through Hollywood with parallel grace. But what few suspected was that beneath the surface lay a bond shaped by the kind of darkness most people never see. They first crossed paths as actors, but they recognized each other as something else entirely. Survivors of an industry that demands everything and returns nothing when the lights dim. Their early conversations were simple, but carried a weight the outside world would never understand. Moments offset where Cruz watched Depp slip into silence without warning, or where Depp caught the flicker of sadness behind her practiced smile. They recognized in each other the cost of being adored, the cost of being consumed. As the years unfolded, their bond evolved into something deeper, something steady like a pulse. Cruz became one of the few people Depp allowed into the quiet corners of his life, the ones filled with unfinished thoughts, half-written fears, and nights when words felt like heavy stones. She knew how to recognize the signs, the slow withdrawal, the long pauses, the way he held a cigarette as if it were anchoring him to the world. And he, in turn, saw through the poise she carried. He understood that her silence sometimes hid exhaustion, that the tranquility she projected often came from years of learning how not to break in front of strangers. They shared a strange intimacy, not romantic, not performative, but anchored in a mutual understanding of what it meant to be fragile in a place that rewarded only strength. There were moments Cruz would later call turning points. Nights when Depp's voice trembled as he admitted he wasn't sure he deserved loyalty from anyone anymore. Days when she arrived unannounced and found him staring out a window, the room dim, the air heavy, as if he were waiting for the world to stop pressing down on him. She didn't try to fix him. She simply stayed, a presence, a witness, a reminder that he had not been abandoned. And there were moments she entrusted him with her own fears. The fear of losing herself in the expectations of others. The fear of becoming hollow under the pressure to remain perfect, calm, unshaken. Depp listened with the rare kind of attention that comes from someone who has walked through his own storms. He knew the cruelty of judgment, the loneliness of fame, the exhaustion of pretending. It was in these exchanges, in the quiet, unseen hours, that their bond solidified. Not with declarations, but with consistency. Not with theatrics, but with the kind of loyalty that deepens every time the world turns hostile. People around them noticed, but no one understood. Assistants whispered. Journalists speculated. But no one saw the nights when Cruz sat beside Depp while he fought to keep his breathing steady. No one saw the messages she sent when rumors became unbearable. No one saw the way he gently reminded her that she was allowed to be human too. Their connection lived in the margins, in the pauses, in the spaces where real relationships breathe. And yet, beneath this bond lay a question heavier than either dared to confront. Had their loyalty become the one thing holding them together, or the very thing pulling them toward the revelation the world would soon hear? There is a point in every storm where the wind no longer howls. It simply presses, relentlessly, against whatever remains standing. For Johnny Depp, that pressure had built for years, tightening around him in ways the public never witnessed. The courtroom battles were only the visible fractures. What lay beneath was a quieter devastation. A man slowly losing his sense of self, his place in the world, even the ground beneath his feet. In private, the collapse was far less cinematic than the headlines suggested. It was not rage, but exhaustion. Not chaos, but a slow unraveling. Friends disappeared. Colleagues retreated. People who once praised him began speaking in cautious tones, as if merely being associated with him carried a risk. And the silence, the heavy, suffocating silence, became the sound he woke up to every morning. There were whispers, rumors of self-destruction, of nights when he walked the edge of dangerous thoughts. The tabloids exaggerated, but they were not entirely wrong. Cruz had been there through some of those nights. She had heard the heaviness in his voice, sensed the tremor under his controlled breathing, and understood the thin line he was walking. She never repeated those moments. She never used them as stories. She carried them like fragile secrets, knowing they were not hers to reveal. But she felt the weight of them, and she feared, more than once, that she might lose him to the darkness that had already claimed too much. Cruz, for her part, had her own battles, the kind she never allowed to bleed into the press. She knew the loneliness fame creates, the quiet terror of knowing millions of eyes can turn on you without warning. She knew the feeling of being misunderstood, of being reduced to headlines, of watching strangers define your life with their assumptions. What they shared was not simply friendship, but a language sculpted by pain. His pauses, she understood. Her silence, he respected. Their bond deepened not through confession, but through recognition. Each saw in the other the wounds they themselves carried. Yet as Depp's troubles deepened, Cruz became something paradoxical, both a pillar and a witness. She watched him navigate a labyrinth of accusations and public judgment that seemed designed not to find truth, but to break him. She saw him lose roles, lose trust, lose entire worlds he once knew. And every time she reached out, she felt how fragile he had become. Still, he endured, almost stubbornly. But endurance is not survival. And survival is not healing. There were days when he questioned whether he deserved loyalty from anyone. Days when he spoke of disappearing, not dramatically, but quietly, slipping away from everything that demanded pieces of him he no longer had to give. Cruz never tried to pull him back with grand declarations. She grounded him with presence, with truth, with the reminder that he was more than the caricature the world tried to paint. And yet, even that was not the whole truth. Because beneath all of this, the support, the loyalty, the unspoken understanding, lay a deeper fracture neither of them dared to name. A fracture caused not by what the world thought of Depp, but by what it forced Cruz to risk by standing beside him. She knew her reputation was collateral. She knew every act of loyalty was another thread tying her to someone the industry had labeled volatile. Every time she defended him in private, she wondered how long it would take for the consequences to reach her. She feared for her image, for her career, for her family. But she stayed, because walking away felt like participating in the very cruelty that was destroying him. This was the truth neither of them ever intended to reveal. That their connection was built not just on loyalty, but on shared vulnerability, on the recognition that both were fighting enemies no one else could see. And as the pressure around them began to intensify, as rumors grew louder and the Hollywood machinery tightened its grip, a question began to haunt them both. How long could they continue living inside this unspoken truth before it demanded to be spoken aloud? The world believed Johnny Depp and Penelope Cruz had stepped back from the spotlight, each retreating into their own carefully guarded privacy. But what no one knew, what not even their closest collaborators suspected, was that something had been forming quietly between them. Not a scandal, not a confession of forbidden emotions, but a creation, a response, a reckoning. For more than 2 years, while the industry speculated about their futures, they had been building something in the shadows. A film that was never meant to follow Hollywood's rules, a narrative born not out of opportunity, but out of survival. It began as fragments, scribbled notes, late-night conversations, whispered fears exchanged in dimly lit rooms. At first, they didn't realize they were writing a story. They were simply trying to understand their own. Cruz remembered the moment she realized this was becoming something larger. Depp was speaking in that low, worn-out voice he used on the nights he felt closest to breaking. He wasn't recounting events for sympathy. He was trying to make sense of the chaos he had lived through. The false narratives, the betrayals, the emotional debris left behind. She listened, not as an actress, not as a friend, but as someone who recognized the weight of stories that had never been allowed to breathe. It was during one of those conversations that she looked up and said softly, "This isn't just your truth. It's our truth, and it deserves to exist." Depp didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at her, as if someone had finally spoken a sentence he had waited years to hear. From that night on, the project took form. Slowly, intentionally, almost reluctantly. They called it Through the Ashes, though the title came much later. At first, it was little more than notes scattered across a tabletop. Scenes that mirrored emotional collapses, monologues that felt like stitched-together memories, and quiet moments where characters said nothing at all because silence carried more truth than language ever could. Cruz took on the role of director, a decision that terrified her not because she doubted her ability, but because she understood the responsibility. She wasn't just shaping a film. She was shaping a confession, a story rooted in real wounds, real battles, real nights where she feared Depp would slip too far into the darkness he tried so hard to hide. Depp agreed to star, but only if the character remained a thin reflection, not a replica. He refused to turn his life into spectacle. He wanted honesty, not exposure. Vulnerability, not victimhood. And together, they began crafting a version of truth that blurred into fiction, a truth too raw to present directly, yet too real to disguise entirely. They knew studios would never allow such a film to exist untouched, so they walked away from all offers. Producers wanted changes. They wanted rewrites, softened edges, reduced intimacy, a more marketable narrative. But Cruz and Depp refused. They invested their own money, a risky defiance against the very system that had once celebrated and later discarded him. There was a strange freedom in this rebellion. They shot in forgotten European towns, in fog-drenched forests, in abandoned theaters where the silence echoed like memory. The cast was small, not celebrities, not polished performers, but people who understood how to inhabit pain with honesty. Some scenes were written. Others unfolded spontaneously, born from emotions too unpredictable to script. Cruz insisted the camera linger on moments Hollywood would normally cut away from. A trembling hand, a breath held too long, a gaze that reveals more than dialogue ever could. She wanted the audience to feel the truth, not watch it. For the first time in years, Depp felt something shift inside him. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter. A recognition that he still had a voice, not the one the media had crafted, but one that had survived despite everything. Yet even as the film grew, so did the risk. Rumors began swirling. Whispers that this project was retaliation, that it was a veiled attack on those who had wronged him. Others speculated about Cruz, why she was risking her reputation, why she was tying her name to his at a moment when most would have stepped back. None of them understood the truth. This film wasn't built out of anger, but out of the need to reclaim their stories from a world that had twisted them beyond recognition. But as they worked, a question grew louder, a question neither was ready to answer. When the world finally sees this film, will it set them free or ignite a storm far greater than the one they survived? There are revelations that simply inform, and then there are those that alter the trajectory of a life. The announcement Johnny Depp and Penelope Cruz released to the world carried the weight of both. But what the public did not expect, what no rumor had even dared to predict, was the final blow delivered near the end of their black and white video. A decision that felt less like news and more like a curtain falling on an entire era of Hollywood. Johnny Depp, with a steadiness that seemed almost rehearsed in its fragility, revealed that Through the Ashes would be his final on-screen role. He spoke without dramatics, without flourish. The simplicity of his tone made the moment devastating. He said he was done, not with storytelling, not with art, but with the version of himself the world had been consuming for decades. He explained that acting, once a sanctuary, had become a battlefield. The craft that once gave him freedom had become intertwined with scrutiny, expectation, and a relentless public hunger for spectacle. He no longer recognized the relationship between himself and the persona that bore his name. And so, with a calmness that unsettled even Cruz, he said he was stepping away. There was a tremor in his voice, not of fear but of release. The sound of a man laying down a burden he had carried too long. Cruz looked at him in that moment the way only someone who has witnessed every fracture beneath the surface could. Her eyes did not widen. She did not attempt to stop him. Instead, she nodded with a solemn familiarity, as if she had known this truth before he ever said it aloud. Later, she would admit that his decision broke something inside her, not because she disagreed, but because she understood why it had to happen. She had seen him unravel piece by piece. She had watched him endure the cruelty of a system that celebrated him one year and erased him the next. She knew this was not a withdrawal from art, but a retreat from the violence of visibility. Her own confession followed, softer but no less profound. Directing Through the Ashes had changed her, not just as a filmmaker, but as a person who had stood too close to someone fighting for emotional survival. She admitted she carried fear of how the world would interpret her involvement, fear of what the industry might take from her in response, fear that she had tethered herself to someone the public viewed through a fractured lens. But above all, she feared losing him. Not as an actor, not as a symbol, but as a human being. Their announcement rippled across social media with dizzying speed. Fans mourned. Critics speculated. Some praised Cruz for her loyalty. Others accused her of fueling a narrative built to salvage Depp's legacy. Industry insiders debated whether his retirement was final or a strategic move. Commentators dissected every gesture from the video, trying to determine what was genuine and what was constructed. But beneath the noise lay something quieter, something the public couldn't rewrite. The truth that Depp and Cruz revealed was not a publicity strategy. It was a culmination of battles fought, of scars accumulated, of a bond tested by shadows few could survive. In interviews following the announcement, both actors showed a rawness they rarely displayed. Depp spoke of wanting peace, not redemption. He described waking up without cameras, without judgment, without a version of himself curated by strangers. He wanted to paint, to write, to breathe in a world that did not demand a performance. Cruz spoke with trembling honesty about raising her children in an industry that had shown her its brightest lights and its darkest corners. She wanted them to grow up understanding truth over image, compassion over spectacle, values she feared Hollywood had long forgotten. What lingered in their words was not despair, but clarity. Yet clarity comes with consequences. The more they spoke, the more one question surfaced, unspoken but undeniable. If Through the Ashes was not a goodbye to each other, then what exactly was it? A monument to survival? A confession carved into film? Or the final act of two artists reclaiming what had been taken from them? The world would have to wait to understand. Because the deeper truth, the one they still held close, was not yet ready to be revealed. And as the video faded to black, the lingering question echoed louder than any announcement. Had they finally freed themselves from the past? Or had they just lit the fuse for a reckoning still to come? When the announcement video ended, the world kept talking long after the screen faded to black. But for Johnny Depp and Penelope Cruz, silence finally returned. Not as an enemy this time, but as a space to breathe. For years, silence had been a prison, a suffocating weight pressing on their ribs. Now, for the first time, it felt like something else, a reckoning, a pause before a new beginning, or perhaps the calm after a storm they had barely survived. The legacy of Through the Ashes was already taking shape long before the film reached its audience. It existed in the reactions, the disbelief, the grief, the admiration, but also in something quieter, deeper, the understanding that two people had dared to reclaim their humanity in an industry that often forgets what humanity even means. For Depp, stepping away from acting was not the closing of a door, but the release of an identity that no longer belonged to him. He had spent decades carrying characters who lived larger than life, characters who shielded him, defined him, and at times consumed him. But now he spoke of wanting to live without a script, to wake without becoming someone else, to rediscover the parts of himself that had been lost under layers of applause, criticism, and expectation. Cruz understood this desire intimately. In watching him let go, she confronted her own contradictions, the actress revered for her poise, yet terrified of the quiet moments in which she finally faced herself. Directing the film had stripped her of performance. It required truth, not technique. Presence, not perfection. Through the process, she discovered a version of herself no camera had ever captured. Their friendship, forged in crisis, deepened by silence, strengthened through creation, emerged as the film's invisible core. It wasn't what tabloids wanted. It wasn't scandal. It wasn't romance. It was something rarer, a connection built through witnessing one another's deepest fractures and still choosing to stay. The world tried to name it, dissect it, label it. But some things resist categorization, not out of secrecy, but out of integrity. As the public debated their motives, something quieter happened behind the scenes. Actors began asking themselves whether they, too, had lost control of their own narratives. Directors questioned how much of their art had been shaped by fear rather than truth. Fans reflected on how easily they had consumed headlines without thinking of the lives beneath them. In that sense, Through the Ashes became more than a film. It became a mirror held up to fame, to suffering, to loyalty, to the uncomfortable truth that behind every public figure stands a private life no one truly knows. But even mirrors can distort, and there remained a part of their story the world could not yet see, the part only they understood. Because beneath the film, beneath the announcement, beneath the emotion of goodbye, lingered an unspoken acknowledgement that the project had changed them in ways they had not anticipated. For Depp, it offered closure, not the tidy, triumphant kind, but a quieter closure shaped by acceptance. He no longer needed to fight for a version of himself he could not control. He simply needed to live. For Cruz, it offered clarity, a recognition of what loyalty costs and what it saves. And for both, it offered a final question the world was never supposed to answer. What happens when two people tell the truth in a place built on illusion? And what will they become now that the truth has finally been spoken aloud? The camera had stopped recording. The announcement was complete. But their story, the real one, the one beneath the ashes, was only beginning.